Welcome back to Impostrix Podcast. I am looking forward to today's conversation with Angela. We actually recorded this like 6 months ago. She was my first podcast recording. And when I went back to edit it, I was like, this is all over the place. Like, I can't, it was like an hour and a half of goodness that I was trying to cut down to half an hour, and I couldn't. So I reached out to Angela and asked if she would agree to record again. And so that is what y'all are hearing today, is the new and improved episode. So Angela, welcome to the show.
I love that happy accident because that means that we get to spend more time together. Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me here.
Welcome to Impostrix Podcast, where we affirm the lived experiences of professionals of color who navigate imposter syndrome and racial toxicity at work. The tools that you learn here will help you confidently address racial toxicity at work, put that imposter syndrome to the side, stand in your power, and resist racial gaslighting. I'm your host, Whitney Lee, a Black mother to Black boy children, a civil rights attorney, and an anti-racism educator and trainer. If this is your first time listening, welcome. We're glad you're here. Episodes are published every week. Make sure you go back and listen to our past episodes. All right, here we go. So let's start by having you introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do, and what identities are you bringing to this conversation?
Well, I don't know why, but I feel really compelled to tell everyone that I'm an elder millennial. I just turned 40 this year. I never lead with that identity, by the way. I rarely lead with that identity. But yeah, it kind of feels like a big milestone. I just turned 40, and I grew up watching Pee-wee on Saturday mornings and eating my fruity pebbles and frosted flakes. I grew up with refugee parents that fled the Vietnam War. So as a result, they had their own stuff. And I grew up with a TV as my babysitter, as many of us did, but for various different reasons. And so my mentors growing up were Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers. And as a result of, my growing up, I recently discovered that I am queer and non-binary, and I'm, in my 30s discovering that. Also, an important part of my identity is that I am a parent to 3 unschooling children. I am a mental health therapist with the recent discovery that I am also autistic and have ADHD. And so that's something that feels really important to kind of normalize too for folks out there that are like late bloomers, but that's even like a term that I don't like using. Late bloomers in many ways, in their gender, sexual exploration, their values exploration, as well as their like neuro differences. So those things feel kind of apparent to me right now. But yeah, shout out to all the elder millennials out there, the geriatric millennial.
I think I might be, I just turned 36. So I don't know if I'm technically in the geriatric millennial camp, but I'm close.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. You are close.
And so thank you for that introduction. I do need to apologize because I think I misgendered you. What pronouns do you use?
They, she. Yeah, this is something I'm getting familiar with too, and I'm feeling out, and it's been sitting with it for a few years now, and that feels resonant for my different parts of me.
Well, I apologize because I'm pretty sure I knew this. I just forgot.
No worries.
So I'm excited to have you here because the way that you support professionals in terms of our mental health is one that I find pretty unique and is not one that I've personally engaged with before. And that is the mind-body coaching, and then also the kind of differentiation of how you work with different BIPOC groups.
Yeah, I really focus my attention mainly on working with first, second, and third generation folks of color. And that means that you have a parent or you or yourself have been transported here to this land somehow through some kind of immigration or forced extrication or some kind of like means of getting here. So I work with folks of color that have experienced immigration trauma themselves or intergenerationally. And that brings up a whole specialized set of issues. And when we're working with folks, specifically folks that I identify with personally, because my parents are refugees from the Vietnam War, there's legacy burdens, intergenerational trauma that our body remembers, but has no context for in the here and now. It just looks like behaviors that are dysfunctional. And so that is the population that I focus on, specifically a version of myself that has these behaviors that were like playing it small, don't really know how to take up space because we've learned in our bodies that it's not safe to take up space. Folks like me who focus and prioritize other people's comfort over our own and who have like a pattern of suppression of our own feelings, needs, desires, fears, hopes in order to do the above two. So that's kind of my like focus in my mental health therapy and coaching practice. And when I work in those lenses of like, okay, you are a first, second, third generation person of color with immigration trauma, that brings up a whole layer of somatic things that might show. You might show up with a headache. You might show up with constant migraines. You might show up with IBS in my practice. You might show up with chronic, some kind of autoimmune disease or muscle fatigue or some kind of chronic fatigue. And folks are like, how is this showing up when I feel like I'm doing fine? Like, yes, I might be highly stressed, but what does my stress have to do with anything in my body? So we go through that first and we just kind of like start to uncover layers and then people start noticing, wow, okay, like I did not know that my current pain has anything to do with my past issues. And we start working, we start doing some discovery work, some unearthing work.
I'm someone who is very new to the somatic work and really since we last talked about 6 months ago, have started to be much more focused, or not even focused, but I've noticed I've been attentive to my body in a way to help me guide how I'm moving through the space. And that's true both in terms of my personal life, but really particularly in terms of my professional life, because I'm finding that there are spaces where my body does not want to be. And I have really struggled, particularly recently, with body pain. It's been really interesting because even I can feel myself tense up. Like I can feel my shoulders high next to my ears when I'm doing certain things or operating in certain spaces or using certain language. And then I can feel myself relax in other spaces. I can feel more what my comfort, what belonging, what living in my truth feels like, even when that thing is hard. And so, like you and I, before I started recording, we're talking about how I'm exiting my full-time job and that I had to have some really difficult decisions and conversations really with a lot of other people about this decision. And even though those were they felt like really high stake conversations, they felt like very anxiety producing. But even having those, because I knew the reason behind those conversations and I knew that this was something that I needed to do to support myself and protect myself, like my body stress behind that was much less than I would have anticipated. And so now, even in these past few weeks of me kind of getting ready to exit and wrapping up all the things, I'm super, super stressed and tense again. And I went and got a deep tissue massage yesterday. That was not supposed to be a deep tissue massage, but something happened on the table where I guess the masseuse felt all the things and
They were channeling all the healing towards you deeply.
yes. Yes. So, today I'm sore. It was one of those deep tissue
Oh my
massages
gosh.
where today I'm like, okay, did I work out last night?
Yeah, you need a
Um,
massage from the massage.
mhm, mhm. But I do feel lighter.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so as I chart this next path forward for myself, I'm just really grateful and really open to
Hmm.
continuing to learn from my body when I'm making decisions that determine whether I'm going right or left,
Mm,
or straight. I'm really able to be much more focused on how my body is feeling around that.
mhm.
So, how do our personal wounds that we experience, whether that's historical trauma that we may not even be aware of, or like today trauma, how does that affect our professional lives?
Yeah, it's a really good question. First of all, just acknowledge what you just shared right now with your transition to work and all that went through it and your body's wisdom, right? In gathering resources before you went in. And that is part of our somatic trauma informed work that your body like already knows about. So you did that before you even knew that you needed to as a way to buffer the effects of that meeting. Second thing that you mentioned was personal wounds, and you said historical and what I would call also add on to that institutional, and then personal, family, and cultural. So there's 4 layers there. And so when you work with a non trauma informed, non systems minded coach or therapist, there's little acknowledgement of the historical, institutional, systemic, family, cultural wounds. They only focus on interpersonal, personal wounds, like with your family members, immediate family members, not even ancestral family, but immediate. And so I do want to acknowledge that that is a huge difference when you're working with more systems minded folks. And so to really unpack the different layers of wounding is a part of not gaslighting other people to believing that, this is something of a personal failure or like family failure that you're going through as a result of a personal family failure. It's it's a result of like systemic historical failures that are really decontextualized, in our time in the here and now. So I want to just like shed light on that, and that this work that we do, if we do it in a way that's honoring to the system, it becomes intergenerationally healing. In my biased opinion, this work, if we don't acknowledge the historical impact, systems impact, and we just keep it whitewashed, professional, psychological, it then just is a blame shifting game where we talk about how our parents have failed us. And that's just it. And that's, so when your question about like, how do our personal wounds affect our businesses? I like to change that word to how do our intergenerational, historical, family, cultural, and personal wounds affect our businesses? Because you can't acknowledge us in our businesses and our personal lives as a silo. We have ancestors
Mhm.
that have given us and cultural legacies, historical legacies, systemic legacies that we carry on our backs unknowingly that are a part of our personal wounds, that affect our personal wounds. Like you can't like silo them, right? And so when I think of that question, I think of, okay, in my business, in my work as an entrepreneur, my personal wounds might show up with me diminishing myself, me suppressing my needs, me prioritizing my clients, me having a fear of showing up on social media because I am afraid of voicing my perspective. And then in the psychological lens, if we think of it individually, we could talk about, Angela, you have a limiting belief about how you have to make yourself small and mousy because your parents are small and mousy and they taught you these things. Yes. And there's a whole system out there that seeks to decimate me and folks like me that don't conform to their standards. And my body and my parts of myself are very aware of that, even though I consciously am not. And so that is part of the work that I like to do with my clients to really create some awareness. Yes, there's like family legacies that are passed down to us through patterns of attachment, and there's systemic attachment that has been like messed up because of the ways that white body supremacy shows up that cause us to have these behaviors too. And
And I can
ultimately it's
just,
from the
oh,
systems.
yeah, stringing all of the pieces together really makes sense to me. And it's nice to hear the language because that's certainly where I'm finding myself and a lot of my community, frankly, at a space right now where we are dealing with a number of wounds that aren't specific to what I, Whitney, have experienced today that are affecting my work. I'll say that. And even as I'm entering this entrepreneurial space, I'm thinking about you, and you use the term like mousy something or other. What I imagine as being like small and quiet. And being an entrepreneur, as somebody who feels small and quiet, how against the grain that might feel. And for me, it's not so much of it's not quite the same, but I did grow up with this feeling of like political correctness and Black excellence. And for me, what that has meant is like the perfectionism. Everything needs to be perfect. I need to be like the best image of myself at all times. And that goes against how I feel. You know, like I had to, I posted something on social media, a video a couple of weeks ago about one of my episodes, which was about compassion. And I felt like shit that day. And I felt like shit because I was going through all this stuff at work. And I felt like I just needed to like be seen in my raw, natural state, which is against what I grew up with, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm not even talking about grew up with in terms of my immediate family, even. Like, sure, when I looked at them, like my parents were put together, they had all the stuff figured out, is what I felt. But even just in terms of like Blackness in the US and how we need to show up and, you know, doing everything better just to be recognized and all of that stuff. And so that's been really interesting. And I wonder for you personally, how your varying identities as being Asian, as being a queer person, and being an entrepreneur, how do those identities impact your career, your professional journey?
Yeah, I know. I have parts of me that have a lot of resonance with what you're talking about. There are parts of me that are very highly attuned to how I do not belong in this culture. They are very vigilant, those parts of me. So in my framework of practice, I like to think of myself as being made up of multiple parts. There's a multiplicity that happens like within us. And the idea is that each part operates on its own set of beliefs, patterns, hopes, fears, desires. They're unique as person's DNA or fingerprints, like each part of us. So think of what you just shared. I think I have these parts of me that are very vigilant, that are very outward facing, and all of our parts are protective. So they're going to do things that protect us in their own ways. So those parts of me keep me small because they believe if I speak up, I might get my head cut off, literally and figuratively. Those parts carry ancestral burdens, cultural burdens. My family might have never, like for you, I do have a different bringing, like my parents were struggled a lot with basic up kind of stuff. So I don't have the same family background, but I could understand if my family provided secure attachment for me, very nurturing family background. I could still struggle with this because there are legacy burdens that are outside of me. They're cultural, they're institutional. So I have parts just like you that you just shared right now, happen to be born from a very dysfunctional family. So that has its own personal wounds and burdens and fears. So those cause me to not speak up, to not have a perspective, to not speak my truth, small and mousy, to not post on social media. I have this thing where I actually been struggling with a podcast myself. I do feel like that is something that I feel very drawn to in this season of my business. And there's this part of me that I'm in this visceral fear of being is the word that comes to mind. And sticking my neck out and then having it cut off, right? And it's a visceral fear that causes me to pull back. So I have this other parts that have all creative parts that are like wanting to speak my truth and to like put my perspective out there, and other parts that like hold me back and suppress those desires. And so when there's conflict like that, I in our framework, we label it as a polarization. So we have like many polarizations and they live in different parts of our bodies even. And when we don't address those polarizations, it's not like they cancel each other out. They actually wreak more havoc on our system. So like for me, when I sit in that polarization, I don't deal with it. I notice my digestive system is just messed up. Like I'm not really digesting my food very well because I'm like, all my stomach acids are not using. And also another thing is my sleep gets all messed up when I'm this for and not deal with it for too long. So yeah, that's how it shows up as an entrepreneur.
I'm curious about the visceral feeling of fear around being beheaded. Is that something that your lineage has experienced? Or do you know where like beheading specifically comes from? As far as your fear?
I have family has this pattern of not sharing much. So I don't know a lot of information about my family story and my family lineage, but I can only guess. My mom was working at the organization USAID in Vietnam when the communist regime started taking over. And she had to hide that. She had to live with like the feeling of being a traitor and what comes with that in the everyday for the sake of the safety of her family before she escaped in the land there. So for her, she had to live with the feeling of being trained. That's what comes up for me. Like when I have a truth, I feel like I'm being a traitor and it feels highly unsafe. But there are parallels to that in our day and age, right now with our truths that we carry right now. We are being a traitor to the US and to be a traitor in our Americanness in a similar ways that my mom was a traitor to her land growing up. And so I could see the parallels there and I could see the hesitancy and I could recognize how my suppressive parts are keeping me safe, but also they don't work for me when I'm trying to thrive. So all of my parts want to keep me in survival mode. And that is success for them. They count that as success. So in my practice with my therapy clients and my coaching clients, especially my leadership coaching clients, they want to move out of their survival season into a thriving season in their business. In that, we have to address all the survival fears of our parts, somatic parts, as emotional parts. If we don't get them on board and in line, they're going to sabotage all of our business endeavors, like making a podcast, Podcast has nothing to do with survival. Making six figures and above has nothing to do with survival. Our parts just want food on the table and roof over our heads. Like air, food, water. That's it. Our parts don't care about us wanting to make a podcast. Our body doesn't really care about that. It wants to keep us safe. So for me, I push up against that every day in my practice for myself and my clients.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you in a second about things that we can do on our own as we're working through this, and if those of us who are not working with coaches. But I wanted to share that the first thing, when you started talking about your mom and working for USAID, what I immediately thought of was courage. And I think that that's so interesting that for me, what can really just be, I mean, an amazing strength of this woman who is needing to do these things for survival, but who is so like convicted in her beliefs that she's doing a thing that she has to hide. You know, for me, that just screams courage. And yet, as part of the value that you've grown up with, because of her experience and others in your lineage, the survival strategy is what like prevails. And I just hope that she has an opportunity to live in her courage, because I just find that so amazing. Because as you also mentioned, we are experiencing this now, and we experience it. I mean, like, it's particularly acute and in our face and present right now because of what's happening in Palestine and Israel and in the Middle East. But it's not specific to that situation, where as we kind of wake up to what's happening, and as we start to formulate our own opinions and belief outside of what's being told to us, experiencing this decision, this choice point of needing to live our truth and suffer whatever consequences we may experience or not, and survive. And so I want to also just acknowledge and recognize that as we're talking about trauma, and trauma-informed advocacy was the episode that we recently released. And now in this conversation, when we're talking about all of the wounds that we come with, that many of us are experiencing situations where it's not possible for us to show up to work today because of the trauma that we're experiencing. Many of us are being triggered. Our ancestral trauma is being triggered. One of my good friends learned recently she was having a very visceral reaction to seeing what's happening in the Middle East, and has close ties to that region, and felt like it was a little bit out of place, and then learned about trauma in her family that explains everything. And so I just hope, whether or not you've got some ties or you're affected by the situation as it's happening, the genocide in Palestine, it could be anything. I mean, it can be, this is what I felt whenever I'm learning about Black people getting murdered in the streets by police officers. But it can be any number of things that we take the time that we need to process. And so I think that's a good segue into wondering, like, what are things that we can do in these moments, Angela, when we're experiencing these feelings, these body feelings that are like shutting us down, that we may or may not be able to identify, acknowledging that like most of us actually have responsibility in people that we're accountable to today, and we can't necessarily just stop everything to care for ourselves.
First of all, I just want to acknowledge how cruel it is that life still goes on with these atrocities loom. That is cruel, that we still have birthdays, that we still have appointments, that we still have vacations that are booked, you know, like in some ways it is very cruel. to not be able to pause and really metabolize in the day to day. And also want to invite us to pause and metabolize in the day to day. The first thing that I can think of is in reference to somatic work, is that we have an essence inside of us. And you kind of noted that with my mom and her courageousness. I believe that like everyone has an essence inside of us, a higher self, a core self that is actually self-healing. That does give us deep interconnections with each other and ourselves, is deeply filled with compassion and curiosity, creativity, courageousness, connectedness, clarity, and choice. But that part of us is really divorced from ourselves. And that is because of white body supremacy and trauma, both intergenerational, personal, and historical, systemic, cultural. And when I think of like, how do we, in a practical day-to-day sense, heal and metabolize, I think of connecting to ourselves, that essence that we were robbed of connection from. That in the big picture and the small picture is part of that reclaiming process, taking back what white body supremacy is taken from us. And so what that means is, what I remember with some of my caretakers growing up, as limited and flawed as they were, they used the body to bring me back to myself. There was rocking in Chinese traditional medicine. We use like a spoon to kind of like shade and draw out negative energy through, like, I remember my caretakers taking some Tiger Balm, rubbing it on my back, and then shaving my back with like a ceramic spoon, of like, even with that like touch and that rhythm, synchronizing our breath, synchronizing our nervous system, and really just like humming the bad energy out from us. When I think of bad energy now, I would interpret that as like burdens that we carry on our systems as a result of white body supremacy. And what that looks like in the day-to-day for me also means befriending my fears, befriending my vigilance, befriending my doubts, befriending my pains. Not, I think in like a lot of what we think about today in modern day psychology or coaching is, how do we reframe our limiting beliefs? And really, I would love, it's been my life's work to challenge that. Instead of reframing, I think that's a very dismissive way to treat our fears and doubts. When you talk to a child and they're like trembling in fear, you don't invite them to like reframe their limiting beliefs. You befriend their limiting beliefs. You befriend their fears. You befriend their doubts, and you wrap them up with a lot of compassion and curiosity. You approach them with a lot of curiosity about their fears, about their behaviors that their fears might take them through, what triggers their fears. You might be curious about what causes them to, I don't know, shut down, and what sensations that their body might have that are associated with their fears. Like, wrap them up in curiosity, not reframe and dismiss. So when we are thinking about the genocide, witnessing genocide, and our parts so fearful that it might happen to us, which it probably has in your lineage, to kind of wrap that up in a lot of curiosity and compassion, and wondering, okay, let's sit with it for a little bit and not be so quick to rush it away. Now, I acknowledge that requires companionship and support, whether in a professional container with a coach or a therapist or a friend that is like really trauma informed, but there needs to be some kind of befriending and not sweeping it under the rug or away.
Thank you. Trauma is just really on my heart these past couple of weeks because of what we're seeing. And I just think that these tools and this conversation and this validation is so vital for so many of us right now in particular. So I thank you for what you've shared with us today. Can you tell us where we can find you and what services that you offer?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. You can find me on Instagram at Coach Angela Tam, Tam is my last name. And my website is my coaching website, which I accept global clients from that are first, second, third generation folks of color, is the unburnoutstrategy.com. And I work with folks globally that want to process their parental pressures that their parents are giving them, living or dead, that still show up today in their workplaces, in their relationships. And specifically, we do one-on-one work or group work. So my next group is opening up in January. But that is where you can find me.
Awesome. And if I recall from our last conversation, you focus in your groups on non-Black POCs. Is that still the case?
Yes. A lot of my clients are folks have lineages in Asia, in the Asian diaspora. I really feel like it is a different experience to be from the African diaspora or the Latinx diaspora, and staying in my lane with what I know and have experienced is part of my boundary work and limitation.
Thank you again for being with us today. And for folks that are sticking around for this announcement, I did want to share with everyone some great news, which is that starting at the end of October, Impostrix podcast is aired on local radio. So if you are in the Atlanta area, you can listen to Impostrix podcast on Mondays at 7 a.m. on WDJY 99.1 FM. So go do that. It's not something that I ever expected would be a thing. Like, I didn't even know podcasts were on the radio, but Impostrix podcast is. So if you are, if you're local, go listen to that. You can also still stream our podcast on your favorite streaming platforms. And I appreciate all of the support that folks are giving the show, because without you, it's not possible. And that's a wrap on today's show. If you enjoyed the show today, don't forget to leave me your feedback, write me a review, rate the show, and share with your community. I would love to hear from you. You can find all of my contact information, and you can find ways to support the show by donating or purchasing merchandise directly on my website, www.impostrixpodcast.com. Until next time, be validated.